Hello, I'm Eric Frickberg and I'd like to welcome you to a special podcast put on by interest.co.nz. The subject is the New Zealand energy crisis is probably too strong a word, but predicament might be too mild. To discuss this, I'm joined by three experts on energy. They are Gavin Evans, a long-serving journalist on economics and energy who's been the face of the online trade journal Energy News for many years. Gavin, welcome.
Hey, Eric.
Also with me is Andreas Heuser. Andreas trained originally as a lawyer. He's worked mainly in economic policy on matters like infrastructure, energy and resources, first of all for Treasury and later for the consultancy Castalia. Andreas, welcome.
Thank you, Eric.
My third guest is John Carnegie. John's worked for 3 decades in public policy, energy markets, climate change, resource management and others. He was Executive Director of the Business NZ Energy Council before heading Energy Resources Aotearoa. This organisation represents a range of energy-intensive businesses, both upstream and downstream, and morphed out of the old Petroleum Exploration and Production Association of New Zealand, PEPANZ, in 2021. John, welcome.
Thank you, Eric.
Gavin, if I could start with you on the question of a secure supply of electricity, especially this winter, keeping the power flowing down the wire. Is there a crisis? Is there a predicament? Or what is there?
I think this winter there are definitely concerns, and it's not collapse of the grid sort of concerns, but the industry was watching really closely last week when we had our second highest ever half-hourly demand peak last Wednesday evening, and we've been lucky in the last few weeks that we've actually had we've got plenty of hydro in the system, but we've come into that cold period, and also we're starting to see periods where we have cold weather and not so much wind.
Well, we've seen at least 11 supply problems so far this year, none of them approaching blackout stage, but heading in that direction. Is that serious, or is that just the system operating as it might anyway?
Well, it's the system operating as it might anyway, but a couple of things have gone wrong. We've got our biggest gas-fired power station out of action now until May next year, and that's tightened things up a lot. We've got a big chunk of the West Wind farm is out of action. So it doesn't take much to tighten up the market in New Zealand.
Well, how reliable are the systems to provide backup in a situation where it might get quite serious?
Generally, pretty good. But it only takes one thing to go wrong. And that's what we saw a couple of years ago, back in August 2021. Somebody made a few wrong decisions and lights went off.
Andreas, if I could ask you, we do have thermal power stations at Huntly that burn gas mainly, but also quite a lot of coal to provide backup. How well do they work in an intermittent system?
Well, I think they were originally designed to be baseload generators, and I think the concept of baseload in an intermittent system, and we're moving into a world where variable renewables will make up an increasing share of the generation mix. Having a slow start thermal generation as a base load will be uneconomic in future as we sort of move to very low cost renewable generation.
Well, what can we do about it? What should we do instead of relying on these units?
Well, I think what's missing is dispatchable generation that can come on quickly and reliably. So gas peakers perform that role, and energy storage that's rapidly deployable could also perform that role. So that's where we need to be investing in future.
Getting back to the existing system at Huntly, is there a problem? They're slow to start, slow to wind down, therefore they're expensive, and perhaps they have needless emissions at each end of that process. Would that be right?
It could be right. I'm not an expert on that.
Okay, so we need more gas peaking plants. Do we have enough? We need more, and who would build them, and will they?
Well, I think that the question is, will they? Do we have the settings right to allow those investments to be made at the right time? So if we've got increasing wind and solar generation in the mix to meet that short burst of power need, that dispatchable power, I think the question is more, are the settings right to incentivise the investment for those to join the grid?
John, a report put out by on behalf of the government just today actually did say that there is a place for gas peaking plants. How easy would it be for people to build them and get finance for them?
Well, in fact, I think it would be easier to build than get finance for in the current environment because, to Andreas's point, the policy, there are a wide range of negative policy signals that actually have been dampening the desire and the investment signals to invest in things like peakers. So I know that there's a company with a consented site in the South Waikato, but it's unlikely. In fact, I think they might have even said that they're not going to build it because of the upstream gas supply uncertainty. So to Andreas's point, in fact, both of my discussants have actually lent into the conversation about actually a crisis or predicament. Actually, what we're facing is an energy gap, and we're facing an energy gap because gas supply has been made harder and harder. And in fact, on the other side, and the reason we're talking about peakers is that unreliable renewables actually can't fill the gap created by an absence of gas in an affordable way. And so we're facing a bit of a conundrum. So how do we actually then ensure that we have A, sufficient gas, and B, the investment being made to allow peakers play the role, which I think everyone, even the IEA, in its recent New Zealand country report said we needed gas peakers.
On that question, there is a suggestion is made quite often that the ban on new searches for off-sea oil and gas in 2017 has had a lingering impact. I'd like to ask you about that, but first of all, is there a problem with ESG principles maybe deterring even banks from being willing to lend on a gas-fired plant?
Oh, possibly. It depends on how they're applied, but I think from a gas supply perspective, I think the narrative around ESG is it's becoming a necessity to help ensure that not only do we have, relative to coal, lower emissions, but we have affordable and reliable energy. And I think we need to actually have a narrative around ESG which accommodates those two perspectives rather than just focusing on absolute emissions.
Okay, is there, on the other point of that question, is there a lingering impact from that ban on new offshore oil and gas exploration that was done without a lot of consultation back in 2017, early 2018?
Yeah, I mean, I think lingering is too soft a word.
What's the right word?
Well, it had a massive and lasting impact on the desire of the upstream to continue to invest in New Zealand's upstream oil and gas supply. And I think you only need to look as far as the likes of NZOG, New Zealand Oil and Gas, who now is investing all of its discretionary resources in Australia. So, it's obviously there's a signal here for the upstream to invest, and we're getting massive investment by Todd and by OMV and by others, mainly because actually you need to invest just to maintain gas supply. And of course it gets even harder when you're talking about all of our fields are on end of life, are reaching end of life. So you're needing actually the case to get investment across the line in the upstream is getting harder and harder and harder.
Is one reason for that rigs are not willing to come down here because of that gas ban, and therefore they're not available to do remedial or exploratory work on existing gas fields that the government says are fine?
Oh, look, I mean, the case in general to get rigs, to get anything, even the workforce, actually, what we've got is with open borders now, we've got workforce heading over to Australia because they're talking about a gas-led transition and a gas-led recovery over there. It's kind of a marked difference in even tone and language at the political leadership level.
Well, presumably, Andreas, New Zealand has to do something about emissions from the energy sector. Are we doing enough, and are we doing the right thing, or are we doing the wrong thing, making it worse?
Well, New Zealand's actually in a really fantastic spot compared to Australia, actually, because we've got low-cost variable renewable generation, and more of that will be developed from wind primarily, and we've got fantastic hydro resources. So we can use the hydro, that's storage effectively, because it's water sitting behind a dam, use that to generate power when the wind's not blowing. What's missing is that final, we're going to get to 98% renewables approximately, just on current settings. It's that last 2% that's going to be problematic. And I think we probably need to think about, I like the adage, let's not let perfect be the enemy of good here. Getting to 100 will be quite costly, and getting that last 2%, eking that out, will be very costly. So, you look at the total emissions from electricity generation, it's 5% of total emissions in New Zealand. 18% of emissions, gross emissions, come from transport. We're doing modelling for one of the major fuel companies that suggests by 2035 half of the vehicle fleet will be EVs, and that is going to be determined by the cost of electricity. So if we're putting up the cost of electricity, and work we did last year suggests going to 100% will put up the cost of electricity significantly. If we're making electricity more expensive, we're making the transition to EVs more expensive, and we're delaying that. So we could have perverse effects here. So
when you say significantly, can you be any more explicit?
Well, others have done work on how much projects such as Lake Onslow, or having a massive hydrogen storage facility to store energy, how much those projects would cost, in the billions and tens of billions of dollars, so 16 billion, I think, for Onslow. And that all has to be paid by someone, and that'll go into electricity prices. So, it's, I think we were looking at like a $7 billion additional energy cost in work we did last year.
Well, Gavin, do you think it was a mistake to go for 100% renewable by 2030 when we could have said, listen, we'll be as good as we can be?
Yeah, of course it was. And it was, people will look back at the Labour government, and I think they'll look at two big mistakes they made. And one was the offshore exploration ban, and the second one was the 100% target by 2030. The thing is, when you make a bad decision, bad decisions often beget further bad decisions. And so they kicked off the exploration ban. It cost them a year in terms of the whole discussion on the climate change legislation, held up everything. And it's become a distraction. I mean, because climate policy is about emission reduction. It's not about taking out certain types of resources from the system. And in an energy system, in a small island country in the Pacific, you want all the options on the table you can for security. And we are lucky because we've got wind, hydro, geothermal, we've also got gas, and we've also got coal. So we should have a very secure energy system. And it's really only the focus on gas that has really distorted the policy discussion in the past 5 years.
Given that it's more expensive to burn gas or coal than get the electricity free from water flowing down a hill, could it have been fixed by the market, since people won't generate using gas or coal if they don't have to?
Yes, but remember, gas-fired generation and coal-fired generation is there for a reason. It's there for when the lakes are low or the wind isn't blowing. It has a functional capacity, so it's not just a direct cost comparison. I mean, we'll build a lot more solar, we'll build a lot more wind, we can do a lot more geothermal, and we'll change the role of the way we use the hydros and the gas plants. We can probably move away from coal. But it's not just a levelised cost of energy equation.
Yeah, no,
they are tools in an energy suite.
In fact, Eric, you're at risk of perpetuating a myth that the wind is free and water is free, and therefore the electricity should be cheap. Unfortunately, I wish it worked like that, but it doesn't. And I think the reason that you have thermal fuels being relatively more expensive is driven by the fact that they're used less frequently. And in fact, as you become more and more renewable in your system, they will be used less and less frequently. And so what you're doing is talking about the period over which their capital and operating costs are going to be recovered. And so it fits nicely to Gavin's point they fit nicely in a diverse fuel and technology electricity system.
So could we have fixed this up with the ETS and business as usual rather than having strong and pointed government directives?
I wouldn't call the ETS business as usual, to be honest. That when it hits $80 a tonne, that's not business as usual, or 30 or 60. I mean, where in any of that equation is business as usual, but we certainly need a robust carbon price to with an ETS with a fixed and declining cap to actually drive the right behaviours. Absolutely, and we're seeing that.
But the government directives are not driving the right behaviours.
Well, no, I mean, things that are technology or sector specific, focused on gross emissions, I'm afraid to say, are virtually worthless, because all they do is there's a thing called the waterbed effect, Eric. I won't bore your listeners with it, other than to say if you push down hard in one area, the emission units appear somewhere else. So there's no net reduction, and literally all you end up doing is chasing your tail. So
yeah, there's a long experience with like deterministic policies having unintended consequences, and there's biofuel mandates in the EU cause deforestation. The German policy to decommission nuclear power plants has just resulted in massive use of their coal-fired power plants. The Climate Change Commission's draft advice made some deterministic calls on what was going to happen in the next few years, turned out to be wrong. So I think that the point about the emissions trading scheme is you set a price, you let the market set the price of what it costs to emit, and agents in the economy, electricity generators and so forth, respond by changing their behaviour.
I mean, my sense, Eric, is that people have actually lost confidence in the ETS now, because we've got a whole raft of government policies which are, they call them complementary measures, are busily undercutting the price signal that should be flying through the ETS, and they're making public policy pronouncements that are seeing the price bounce up and down. So, and that's in the forestry sector and in the energy sector. So no one's actually quite sure how to approach the ETS now, which in itself is problematic, because it is, and we should be extremely pleased about this, it has become a core part of our economic architecture. It's a fantastic tool. We just need to actually let it work.
And not have governments coming in doing something to cut the price and then doing something else to push it back up again.
Yeah, undercutting property rights so people don't, one of the things we've heard is the reason the price fell from 80 to 30 is because foresters no longer had confidence that their investment would be safe. So have a guess what they did? They dumped their units, right? Now that probably actually isn't on the one hand, it's quite a rational response, but on the other, it's not actually helping us achieve our objectives. So, politicians shouldn't be jawboning the ETS price up and down.
On the subject of large-scale government interventions, Gavin, one of them is the Lake Onslow pumped hydro scheme proposed for Central Otago. What's your view of that in terms of solving the problem or not?
Well, when I talked before about bad decisions begetting other bad decisions, this is what happens when you start deciding that you're going to take gas out of the economy, and then you decide that you're going to have a 100% renewable target by 2030. Then you have to have a means of delivering it, and that's when you start looking at things like Onslow. And even before it was at 16 billion, it was probably still a bad idea, because it's in the wrong part of the country. The geological risk is quite high. Yes, you can build it there, but what is it? Why? You want an affordable, reliable electricity system, and 16 billion is not affordable.
So 16 billion is a lot of money. Now, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment quite liked Lake Onslow because he said it would depress wholesale prices. That sounds contradictory to your position.
Well, nobody has yet explained exactly how this thing would work. If it's going to be in the market operating every day, then a big scheme like this will certainly could certainly depress prices, and the argument is that it would take away winter power risk, the dry year risk, and that would be reflected in forward prices. That didn't actually happen when we had the Whirinaki diesel-fired plant running as a reserve station. And even then, if it's going to be in the market, it's just going to push out other generators, isn't it?
So there won't be an overall gain.
No. And in fact, I'd say it's probably making investment decisions right now quite difficult.
So people are not investing now because they're scared of the impact of Lake Onslow if and when it gets built.
Well, they've certainly gone ahead with a bunch of big projects, which is good. You've got Harapaki, Turitea, you've got Kaiwera Downs, and I think you'll see more, but it's just complicating the picture for them. It's definitely adding to risk, isn't it? If you want to build a power station, you're looking at this thing. Are they going to go ahead with it? If they are going to go ahead with it, what's it going to look like? Who is going to run it? You know, there are so many unknowns.
John, would you share that view?
Yeah, I've had Onslow described to me as dumb as a box of hammers, Eric. So,
That's forthright.
yeah, so couldn't disagree with that.
Well, it remains to be seen whether it'll be built, doesn't it? Because we're still at the business case scenario stage, aren't we?
Yeah, well, I think the point that Gavin's making is just the very conversation and threat of it is actually having a negative impact on investment confidence. And, again, while, I think there was some, even if it was built and filled, it would take through to about 2035, I think was the year. So what are we going to do in the meantime when our system, A, is becoming more heavily renewable and intermittent, and no one's building the gas-fired peakers that we're going to need in the interim?
So Lake Onslow is this monster looming on the horizon. He's still scaring the children, even if he doesn't actually attack.
Well, look, we'd prefer the phrase, the sword of Damocles.
All right, okay. If you didn't build Lake Onslow, one or two other things have been suggested, such as burning woody mass from the pine forests in Kaingaroa in the plants at Huntly instead. Does that make any sense, Andreas, do you think?
So I think we need to sort of keep our options open, I think, for the future. We don't know what technological solutions will emerge. I'm working with GNS at the moment on supercritical geothermal, which is in development and in future could be a fantastic source of electricity. So there are all these options that are available. I don't think we should put all our sort of eggs and all our chips into this one big bet with lots of high risks and significant negative environmental impacts. Given that we don't know what other options are out there yet.
What exactly is supercritical geothermal? Is it able to be more flexible than normal geothermal, or what?
Well, geothermal can be flexibly deployed. Studies in the US have explored this, but supercritical geothermal is essentially accessing supercritical temperature fluid from deeper than conventional geothermal. It's just another resource. Like we've used the geothermal resources we've got, plus there's some more coming on stream, but this is it's deeper and higher temperatures.
I was going to say it's deeper and hotter, therefore you get more bangs for the buck, as it were, presumably from the same pipe.
From new pipes, but deeper, and it's an untapped resource as yet.
So would geothermal be a better option than woody mass?
Well, it could be, and we're looking into that.
I don't think there's any doubt that if we had a bigger share of geothermal in the system, it would make it easier to manage. It would give you that base load stack that used to be provided by the gas and coal-fired plants. Not generally that flexible. I think that's the engineering challenge with geothermal. One of the issues in New Zealand, of course, is that the iwi interests in most of the geothermal fields, they're actually more interested in jobs than power generation per se, so there's a bit of a challenge there. But I mean, a policy focus on geothermal, would actually probably take us a long way in terms of security.
Geothermal has provided approximately, I think the figure is 18%, and a lot of people have said, you can't keep on drilling because the pressure goes down. But is that problem overcome? You can make it much more than 18%.
I think we're a lot better at managing fields than we were. That every field is different, the chemistry is different, the reservoirs are different, but we're better at developing them in a modular level and learning. We shouldn't be turning our back on it.
Yes. Sorry?
I was going to say, Eric, I think the two things that are coming out of this part of the conversation are firstly, who puts their money, who picks the risks? Should government be doing that, or should the private sector be putting its weight and knowledge and resources behind determining what the next bit of technology is in the merit order? And actually the second thing is, if you want affordable and reliable energy, you need a diverse portfolio of fuels and technologies. So I think they're two good almost principles to help you determine what you should be doing in the electricity and indeed in the wider energy sector.
The electricity industry at the moment is about, on average, 85% renewable. Andreas, you said it could go up to 98%. Energy as a whole is only about 25% renewable. So various experts have said that if we could electrify the whole energy system with things like EVs, for example, we'd make a huge amount of progress. Is there enough money available for that sort of investment? Because I've read figures in the tens of billions of dollars. Is there money around for that?
So in transport, I think it's going to happen. It'll be hard to find a petrol-fueled car in 15, 20 years, I predict. So, that's on a cost basis. They will be lower. They'll have a lower total cost of ownership compared to a petrol vehicle. So, I think in transport we'll see a transition. We're doing some work on buses. Buses are rapidly becoming cheaper to operate with battery electric rather than diesel. So, in the transport sector, it's going to happen. There's going to be investment needed in transmission and distribution infrastructure, but I haven't seen anything to suggest that that's not financeable, and investors won't recover their cost of capital.
But I have seen figures of tens of billions for transmission and distribution alone, to say nothing of the generation. That's a hell of a lot of money, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the money is available?
Well, we're spending billions of dollars on T&D every year anyway.
T&D?
Transmission distribution.
Yeah.
So, I haven't seen anything to suggest that this is some insurmountable financing challenge.
Yeah, there doesn't appear to be a shortage of capital. And in fact, we just saw an example of that yesterday with the BlackRock announcement, fund, pot, however you want to describe it. But I think in terms of renewable energy, Eric, I think our number in New Zealand is actually 41% renewable energy, which, again, I think to Andreas's earlier point, we need to congratulate ourselves. I think that's the third highest in the world. I think it's Iceland and Norway, I think. And I think, I agree with Andreas. I don't think there's a capital shortage. I think actually that the issue is, how do we simply move that 60% in which the economy is reliant, which is non-renewable, and increase the 40%. And I think key to that is the upstream sector. They will be pivotal. They will be the ones doing the heavy lifting. And they, in fact, are the ones with the adaptive capacity, the human resources, the skills, the financing. They've got that, and how will they help? Because they certainly want to shift from non-renewable to renewable energy, and I think that's the challenge that we're facing. Transport, you'd think, would be some low-hanging fruit in that equation.
You mentioned BlackRock. Andreas, what sort of impact would that have, do you think, or is it just one of many that'll have to be made, many contributions that'll have to be made?
So the BlackRock announcement yesterday, as I understand it, is that they've announced a fund. BlackRock will be like an intermediary, raising capital from investors and deploying that to New Zealand renewable energy projects. I think New Zealand was already an attractive destination for foreign capital, domestic capital, for renewable energy projects. We've worked with investors looking at solar farms, and it's an easy place to do business. The settings are relatively good, so I think it's great. It's probably going to, at the margins, lower the cost of capital margin slightly because it'll give New Zealand a bit more of an international profile, but I don't think it's a huge game changer.
So the fact that BlackRock have come at all is an indication that we're doing okay already, rather than being something that's really important in its own right.
Yeah, I think that's a fair summation.
Couple of final points. Gavin, green hydrogen and TY Point. Starting with green hydrogen, how successful do you think that would be?
I think green hydrogen has some obvious sort of niche applications already, because I mean we already use hydrogen in parts of the economy, so it makes sense to make those green. I mean, there's quite a bit of attention on hydrogen down south in trucking fleets. HWR Richardson doing the dual fuel, that looks like quite a clever application if it comes off. There's ammonia, there's fertilizer. You can scale it up. I'm not a big believer in export scale hydrogen. I'll wait and see. Why not? I mean, the thing that probably disappoints me in this whole energy debate is that we used to have this ambition about using this renewable bounty to actually build an economy and build some industries, and we seem to have lost sight of that. I mean, if hydrogen can be part of that, that would be great. But why not? We tend to talk about hydrogen versus a smelter. I think what's wrong with having one of the world's lower carbon smelters here, if we can make it work? There is so much energy in Southland. There's plenty of scope for more. But we've got to have policy settings that encourage that investment, and the power has to be reliable. And in a renewable system, that means having firming backup for when the lakes are low.
Getting back to gas peakers and things,
yeah.
Sean.
Yeah.
John, what do you think about hydrogen?
Oh, look, I mean, our position is we love all sources of energy, and why would we not? The issue is making sure that we've got the regulatory firmament, the framing, right, to let them all emerge at the right time, the right place, for the right cost. And a part of that isn't picking any particular winner. It's just making sure that they can all emerge. I wonder why we're focusing on electrolysis as the basis for hydrogen. Just about all of our hydrogen now is produced by gas steam reforming. You have that with carbon capture and storage, which we haven't talked about today. You've got low carbon hydrogen, and the thing that I worry about, in fact, you mentioned it, Andreas, this perfection being the enemy of the good. We're waiting, and it's like waiting for Godot for green hydrogen, right? In the meantime, we've got Australia making coal seam-based hydrogen that they're stripping the carbon out of. They're selling and they're stitching the market up with China and Japan. So by the time we get maybe 15, 20, 30 years, if I'm being optimistic, we've got a export industry based on green hydrogen. We'll be actually, unfortunately, like most things, we'll be a bit player. We'll be on the margins scrambling for the crumbs off the plate, whereas now we could just be doing it with the CCS and selling it through to funnily enough, we sit on an incredibly energy-hungry part of the world. It's just over the way, so why aren't we taking advantage of it?
Okay, just before I finish then and go back to TY Point, on the question of carbon capture and storage, do you think that's a good idea? Do you think it's workable? Do you think it's practical in New Zealand?
Yeah, well, we had a bit of work done by someone sitting not too distant from me, who bunch of scenarios. The gas demand, although it was declining in all of our scenarios, gas use with CCS was by some significant margin. I think it was just under $7 billion over, I don't know, I think it might be out to 2035. It was cheaper. And the next best was actually doing nothing other than what we're doing now. And then the one after that actually was green gases. And I think the margin was a $7 billion difference between natural gas with CCS and renewable gases. So, it's a no-brainer.
So do you agree with that on carbon capture, Gavin?
It's staggered me the way carbon capture has been, the argument has just been ignored in this country. It's always been part of the IPCC scenarios. It's always been on the IEA's books. I don't know why we have this apparent aversion to it here. We've got the fields, we've got the old fields, the geology in other areas, saline aquifers and things. It's no reason it shouldn't be possible here. We've got plenty of drilling experience in this country.
Okay, final question. Would it help if we shut down the smelter? What do you think, Andreas?
Well, I don't think well, who would shut it down? I think the owners should make decisions based on the cost of power, and I think the cost of power made available to the smelter should be set by the relative supply and demand of power on the rest of the grid. And so I don't think anyone in particular should shut it down other than the shareholders of the smelter.
So this argument that's made for New Zealand Inc., we could all get better, we'd all have more if they had less. You don't agree with that? Power.
Well,
I mean, there'd be more electricity available for us if they didn't use so much, 1/7 of the total output.
Right. So I think we come back to what we started with. If with more variable renewables on the grid and that intermittency issue, would an additional hydro resource feeding into the grid help with that? And therefore, is the value of that power higher on the grid than it is for the production of aluminium? Then, if that equation works out, then sure, shut it down.
Would you agree with that?
Well, I'm one of those people who likes to see things built. We don't have we don't have an electricity system for the sake of producing electricity. We make electricity to run businesses, create an economy, have jobs and employment, and a standard of living, and hopefully a growing standard of living. Now, we can have a very green system by shutting down things. I don't think that's the economy people want. We could, we're struggling to pay for some things as a country now. Surely we should be using that resource, and the jobs that come with it.
Look, electricity, whatever its makeup, should go to the highest value use. And clearly that's Tiwai at the moment. And, I'm kind of hoping that, if or when they make decisions about coming or going, they make them based on a robust set of policy settings that, don't skew things one way or the other. And, I think it's a funny state of affairs we are as a society, where we're publicly musing about whether or not we should close a major piece of industrial kit. We've done the same for the steel mill and for others. It's like we're getting very good as a society about saying no to things, but we're very bad at saying yes to things. So, I can't quite understand why we would want to even contemplate closing one of our major industrial sites that earns export revenue and actually helps us stay prosperous as a nation.
I think there's a broader issue here, because this often gets put into the climate kind of frame. But the aluminium industry globally is still highly coal dependent. And you're talking about shutting one of the lower carbon smelters. So what kind of sense does that make?
And highest purity as well.
That's right. And we have a similar situation with methanol. A large part of Asia Pacific methanol comes from coal. And we've recently shut one of our 3 production plants in New Zealand because of a gas shortage. So how is that helping emissions? It just goes on and on. And
so politicians should face up to the fact and be prepared to say that gas might not be ideal, but it's a whole lot better than coal. So let's have that step-by-step progress towards ultimately renewables.
Absolutely. And I think if industries in New Zealand, we deliver real climate benefits when we clean up our own industrial processes. I mean, the smelter at Tiwai has taken huge emissions out in its lifetime, and it'll continue to do so. So is New Zealand Steel. So will Methanex, given the opportunity, given the right policy settings. Why wouldn't we do that?
Yeah,
gas is our Goldilocks fuel. I mean, it's the perfect fuel for the right circumstance.
Yeah.
We should be using it where it's needed. We shouldn't be artificially trying to depress its use, because, to Andreas's earlier point, all that will do, and in fact we're seeing that now, will lead to unintended consequences. I mean, I think from my perspective, the use of natural gas is actually our energy system's safety net.
I think, look, if we're really serious about climate change, we've got to be serious about it being a global issue, and to the point about, shutting down things domestically for domestic reasons, when we're talking about internationally traded commodities like aluminium ingots or methanol. If we're shutting off the supply of those commodities, it's not going to do anything for demand, and it'll just be manufactured somewhere else in the world, and in some cases with higher emissions.
Okay. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Gavin Evans, Andreas Heuser and John Carnegie. I appreciate your comments. Fascinating stuff, and we'll talk again sometime.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.